Welcome folks to another edition of Photo Australia. We've all been guilty probably of buying more software than we need or looking at it all. Is there really a difference? Do we know what's the best software? Do we care what's the best software? So we've asked ourselves this question, and we're getting quite a collection of different softwares between Brad and I. So today, shortly, we're going to choose an image randomly from a choice of some 100 raw images that we've just picked out of our files, and we're going to both process using different software. I'm going to process using DxO's PhotoLab 3, which I've been using now for a while, and I really like it. Brad, afternoon. What is your choice of weapon?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm going to use Lightroom today, so it's software I've used all the time and I'm very comfortable with. So I'll show you through that software and what I do, and I believe we're going to process the same photo. That's correct, is it, Grant?
It is. We will go over here and we'll bring up the folder of our photos that we have put together. Now this is just a random selection. I went through and just plucked out anything I thought might be handy to use as examples going forward. So Brad, I'll flick back to you. Pick one, choose one. These are all raw. Most of these, to say most, because no doubt, oh yes, I can see a couple of JPEGs there, but most of these are raw photos.
Okay, all right. Let's have a look here. I reckon we'll go with something along the lines like one of your dark photos. And what do we got here? All right, there's one there that's 407. If we have a look at that one, I'm only looking at the small icons on Grant's laptop here. And let's have a go at it.
No worries.
And see what happens.
Okay, we'll be right back, folks. We'll just get this over onto the other computer and we'll come back with and open up the software and show you what it all does.
Okay, we're back now. I've just loaded into Lightroom, so if we just whack over to mine. So this is my screen here. So I've got Lightroom loaded up here. I've just added in the photo off my desktop. And I've just gone into the develop module. So what are you doing over your side there, Grant? I'm ready to go.
I'm just loading up DxO's PhotoLab 3, and I'm going to choose 407 we chose. So yeah, I'm all set to go as well. I'll just give you a quick little rundown on DxO. On the left hand side of the screen you have these tabs up the top here. Photo library I'm in currently, and that's pretty self-explanatory as what it does. The one next to it, customize, is where we go to make our changes. The left hand side of the panel tells you all about the image, how it was taken, when it was taken, with what, etc, etc, etc. You've all seen this type of stuff before. Your preset editor, if you create presets going forward, then you can save them into that. We come across the top and you've got some buttons up the top here, icons which are duplicated from the right hand side. So I'll get to the right hand side and I'll very quickly run through this and then let Brad talk to you about Lightroom. Histogram, of course, I don't have to say much about that. It's the same in any of the software that you use. A histogram is a histogram. HSL I will come back to because that's a really interesting tool. Then your essential tools, smart lighting. I'll just turn smart lighting off. Now that is your unadulterated photo, straight off the camera, the raw image. Smart lighting is, I guess, a little like the auto button on a Lightroom, where you let the program have a go at deciding what is best for you. One of the things about DxO I really do like is the up and down arrows on their adjustments in addition to the sliders. So if you move a slider across, if, for example, what we're doing here, and then you want to just, it's a tad too much and the slider's a bit fiddly to move with, you can come across here and just pull it back a couple of stops with the down arrow there. Don't like that, want to go back to as it was, double click on the slider button and it resets itself. So you come down, Clear View Plus, sort of like the haze removal that we looked at a while ago in raw therapy, if you remember that, and Lightroom has a haze removal function as well. Look, use this type of thing very sparingly, folks. It's good, works really well when you got genuine haze. This shot doesn't have a lot of genuine haze, so if I use it, this is the result you'll get. And I'm not really sure I like that, so you would handle that carefully. You can adjust it, its intensity, etc., etc. So I'll turn that off for the moment. You notice again, you can turn each of these functions on and off as you go through them. So coming right down through light, often these functions are duplicated within sections, your colour, etc., etc. So I'll handball back to Brad now.
So just looking at this photo, Grant, so where is this photo?
That's about an hour and a bit south of Adelaide. It's a beautiful part of the world on the Fleurieu Peninsula, which is where we live, of course. Yeah, it's a great spot, and that's just around from the Middleton Point, a very popular surfing beach, and you can see one of them out there into it. And different sort of surf to the Gold Coast and Queensland and that type of surf, but a lot of fun nonetheless.
Very good. Okay, so what I'm going to do with Lightroom, I'll just quickly go over the main features of Lightroom just in the develop module. So on the left, you can actually have presets that I'm not a big preset editor, but it can make things a lot simpler, especially if you're beginning in Lightroom or if you're processing very similar photos. So if you've got a bunch of different photos that you, say if you're just a straight portrait guy and you've got a basic settings that you do to all your portrait photo shoots, your presets could come in very handy for that. So over on the left here, you can set up different, Lightroom comes with presets that you can try out. I would suggest that most people comes up with their own presets, and I do have some that I have put into Lightroom, but I always seem to find that I always like to have a bit of hands-on. I seem to process depending on my mood, and I can get moody, Grant. But yeah, so I just find that I just process on my own. Because I've got used to Lightroom fairly well, I'm usually pretty quick. I only spend, say, around 3 minutes on a photo in the beginning stages and then move on to the next one. And I just keep that process up, and then if I'm going to be a bit more serious with that photo, or then I'll fine tune it. If it's for printing or anything like that, I'll then go back and fine tune it. But on the left here, so you've got your presets. You've also got your history and your collections. So that's more of an organising type side is on your left for navigating and that. Down the bottom, you'll have your film strip, so you can have multiple photos down the bottom. That can be handy if you're dealing with, say, stitching photos together, or if you're stacking, or you're wanting to quickly go between multiple photos, you can just click on it and it'll take you to the next photo. On the right hand is where all the business is done. So Lightroom mainly wants you to work from top to bottom, and I sort of just pick on the things I want to change in a photo, but I'm usually always in this first tab is called the basic tab. Quite often when you download Lightroom, a lot of these tabs are closed, so there's a little triangle on the right to open up those tabs, and I leave most of them open that I use. But the first one is, and where I concentrate mainly on, is the basic tab. In here, you can change the temperature of your photo, which can be handy if you're photographing in under lights or different things like that where you want to change the temperature back. You've got tint, then you've got exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance and saturation. So they're all under your basic tab. And usually the first thing is up the top here on the right, you've got a histogram. And I always try to finish my photo where I'm touching with my color range here. I usually like to try and touch that to the right, not clipping, but just to touch it to the right. And the blacks, I'm not as concerned if I'm clipping on blacks. That's me personally, because I believe that if something is absolute black, it needs to be absolute black, which is known as clipping. So on these little, I call them goalposts, or it was a pro that told me he called them goalposts, so now I call them goalposts. But on the left there, you can even put your mouse over it and it will show you on the screen all the little areas that are absolute black, that are clipping. So at the moment, if my histogram is narrow, it will make the photo appear to be flat. Whereas if you work on your whites and blacks, your highlights and shadows, and start expanding it, you'll find your histogram will stretch out and you'll have a range from absolute black to absolute white. And with that, it will give your photo a lot more depth in the color range and mainly in the brightness and from your whites to your blacks, which I find is very important for photos as well as black and white photography. I see a lot of black and white photos that are very narrow and they just appear grey or flat, and that's exactly the same for your colour photos as well. So the first thing I'm going to concentrate on here, so I'm going to go to the whites slider, and don't ever be afraid to push them all the way to 100 and minus 100 if you're a bit unsure of what these sliders do, and that way it will give you a bit of an idea of what you're doing and what you're changing on the slider. So with this here, you can either just grab and slide the slider, or you can even use your mouse wheel if you want to fine tune the slider, and you can just scroll up and down. And you'll see my histogram will change a lot as well. So that's just with the whites, and the same with the highlights, where it's just actually changing and detecting the highlights in the photo. And the other thing's the shadows. This is a very dark photo, so if you want to get a bit more detail in the shadows, whereas at the moment it's very dark, you can just pump the shadows up a little bit and it will give you a bit more detail in those shadows. So same with blacks. Quite often I will minus just a little bit on my blacks, and that just helps to get everything over into the dark point. But this is a very dark photo, so this won't need a lot on it. And I basically start processing and looking. This is important to have a good monitor when you're doing this, so because you're really guided on the colors that your monitor is producing and the brightness that your monitor is producing. So if you've got a PC and a monitor in front of you, make sure you calibrate it. These, I must admit, Grant, I haven't got to that stage of calibrating yet. These monitors are pretty good, but they're old. They're old monitors, but yeah, just make sure that you calibrate. So I'll swing over to you, Grant, and see what you're up to.
Thanks, Brad. Well, a couple of things I'm going to have a quick look at here and play with for you in DxO is HSL. Now, this is really handy. Unfortunately, this image is not going to show it to its best.
I picked a good one.
You did. But still, it'll give us enough of an idea. So we turn it on by clicking on it, and you see the white button lights up. And you've got your colour channels across the top here. So if we click on the red channel, for example, you'll notice the colour wheel here on the right hand side has now picked out the reds in the image. Down the bottom here, the two little dots down the bottom here, we can expand that range here. So we can decide that And looking at the image, and I'm looking at it on a laptop monitor, not a big monitor here.
I've got an advantage.
Yeah, you do have an advantage. And I can look over there and see it on that one over there, but anyway, I'll just deal with this. So there's a fair bit of reds, oranges, golds in this photo, in amongst the darkness. That's because I always underexpose. My concern in this shot is to maintain the detail in the sky, and the sun is coming up on the right hand side over here. The sunrise was actually happening, as you can see on the rocks, the light coming through. So my aim is to preserve as much of that and then work on this later. So we come back to the colour wheel. Now I grab the dot on the inside of the circle there, and I slide him around towards the golds, okay? And I'll pull the top one back. I don't want to get too far into the greens. Now, come down to the saturation now, and I'll just slide this across and have a bit of a play. And as you can see, we're picking up the reds and the golds, and the oranges are starting to really leap out of the photo. Always turn your luminance back a bit when you're doing that, and you start to get a different feel on the photo. So that's a starting point. Local adjustments. Come down to this, click on the tool icon, and I come over here. Oh, I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to do that. I want you to do that. Thank you. Now, we get the adjustments come up in here. So we have a graduated filter that we could apply at this point, and that's also available on the right hand side as well, but this handy little tool pops up in here. We can drop in a control point if we want to. You can auto mask it out, brush it out, erase elements of it if you wanted to, create a new mask or new layer, reset the whole thing, and apply a brush. The brush tool is quite interesting in this because I love the way it works. Once I've clicked on it, and as you can see up here, the size of it comes into play, and you can see what it's doing. And I like the way it works, this brush. I like it better than what Lightroom does actually, which is why I'm using it. So you can go around and play to your heart's content with the brush if you want to. I may come back in here and do a little bit with the brush on a couple of these rocks, just being fairly rough here to give you an example. So now that I've done that, we can adjust the exposure on the rocks if we wanted to, and I've got a bit of the water in that, but you'll get the idea. This is extreme of what is out there to do, so pull it back. You can do the same with the contrast. You can do the same with your micro contrast, which is a great tool as well. Your clear view plus is, that can be done off the brush tool, pulling it into various fine detail areas. Your highlights, your midtones, your shadows, your blacks, and you can come down here to your colour, and you get your colour temperatures, your hues, your saturations, etc, etc, etc. You can do all of this on a very micro level throughout the image. So it's a pretty powerful piece of software, Brad.
Yeah, definitely.
And persist with it, and it can come up with some really good results. So while I mess around here, I'll flick back to you.
So on here at the moment, I'm still just lightly adjusting a few things. As you can see, it's a relatively hard photo to process because of the low light situation. But so a lot of what I'm making are small adjustments. So as you can see with the histogram from what you saw last has changed a lot. I'm now getting more to a white point. And through what I've done here is mainly concentrated on the shadows. So I've added a little bit of brightness into the shadows. I've added a little bit of white to the photo to bring that histogram up a bit. I've actually dropped a little bit on highlights because on the right hand side of the photo you can see that that's where the sun is. So I don't want to overblow that and make that too obvious. With all photos, I say that your eye is always drawn to the brightest part of the image, and I didn't want the brightest part of the image to be up far on to the right. And now I've got a little message coming up from the security software. Get rid of that. And so I've also grabbed an adjustment brush while Grant was talking, and this centralmost rock in the photo, and I've just highlighted where I've adjusted. I've adjusted and put just a little bit more detail in that rock. I just found it was just a little bit too dark. So I want, especially with around the other sides, that you can see detail in the rocks. So I just brought that up just a little bit. And through that, then it gives you a bit more eye to pull into the middle of the photo. I've also grabbed a grad filter, and I've dropped that over the top part of the sky, as you can see here. And I just dropped it down because I lifted the light levels in the whole photo. I wanted to drop them back down as they were becoming the most brightest part of the photo. So what I've done there is I've put the grad filter over the top of the sky and just brought that back down a little bit. So it's all about doing little adjustments, looking where you want the person's eye to fall when they see this photograph. When I look at this photograph, I want them to see the main feature rock in the middle, and I also want them to see the surfer in the background on that wave. So the last thing I want to do is make that the darkest part in my photo. Otherwise, it will get lost, and people will mainly look at, and their eye would shoot too far to the right instead of looking at what's in the photograph. So if you keep that method to most of your photographs of, okay, I want people to look into my photograph and push their eye into the image, process it that way. That way that when you first see the photograph, you see exactly what you want to see. So now I'm going to go down. I've also got HSL tools here, and what I've done is I have moved the yellow point slightly, and that way, because as I started brightening things, the yellow was overpowering, so I've just brought the yellow down a little bit. And the interesting thing is I'm just looking over what I'm capturing, and it's slightly different than what I'm editing, which is interesting too. So I don't know what's going on there, but we'll see what it looks like after it's recorded. But so now as I go down, so as you scroll down, you can actually do split toning, which can be helpful for some scenes if you want to give it a certain feel. So what it does is, I'm not going to do it to this photo, but you can actually click on highlights and you can drastically change the whole tone and the whole pitch of the photo. You can as you can see, I'm going extreme on these colours, but you can give your photo a completely different mood, leaving it with the natural colours. I don't do it a lot, but occasionally, say if you're in some of the cityscapes, I might then just put a colder split tone on it to give you that coldness feel, if that's what I want to get across to the viewer. So you could do that with highlights and shadows. With most of the photos, I don't muck around from the natural look of the photos, but it is there. The next one's sharpening. So under the detail tab, you can it's already put a slight amount of sharpening on there. I do play around with the radius, and it's usually got a lot to do with the type lens I'm using. So if I'm using, especially in nature photography, I don't fool around too much with landscape, because I find that most of my lenses are not Nikon sharp, Grant, Nikon sharp. Mm-hmm. So I don't tend to have to worry too much. I usually adjust it to 1.2.
They've made a sharp one, have they?
Oh yes, oh yes. Yeah, you cut your finger on it, Grant. Don't even look at it; it's that sharp. So I normally would sharpen a good lens at a 1.2 radius. If I did have, and this isn't against brands or anything like that, but going back, I had a Sigma lens. It was actually a great nature lens. It was a 70 to 500, if I remember rightly. Fantastic range. Had a great time with that lens. But it was slightly soft at the 500 for my nature shots. And when I say slightly soft, it didn't mean that it was soft. It was only when you're looking at the real nitpick little details, you could just see it was slightly softer than my other lenses. So I'd use a 1.5 radius on that lens to sharpen it. And I found that helped, that it was using a greater radius on the sharpening helped it a lot because it was that slightly softer. So getting back to the sharpening sliders, we've got masking. I use masking a lot now. If you hold the Alt key down, or I think it's Option on a Mac, it brings up, as you grab this slider, it will show you what your sharpening as far as masking goes. I find this very handy. So when your screen is all white, like you're seeing right now, it means it's sharpening the whole entire photo. And this comes in handy with my nature stuff as well. As I pull it down, everywhere where it's black, it's no longer sharpening. But everywhere where it's white, it is sharpening. So you can actually pull a mask over what you're sharpening, and you pull it to the degree of where you want it to sharpen. And that way, that especially if you've got a little bit of noise in your photograph and you don't want to sharpen the noise, that's the biggest problem with sharpening the whole photo. If you've got a bit of noise in there, you're going to make it really noisy. So with this, you'll end up just sharpening the lines, the outlines of everything. And then you can actually, if it is a little noisy, this photo looks fine, but if it is a little bit noisy, you can then add a little bit of noise reduction. So that way you're sharpening the lines and add a little bit of noise reduction. You're not softening those lines as much by doing it that way. So I find that very handy to do. Lens correction, I always use my lens corrections. I find that Lightroom's got a great list of lenses that they used, and if you have a look here, Grant used his 24 to 70 2.8 lens, so I can see what Grant used. So there's a profile for that lens in Lightroom, so that if there's any distortions in any lenses, Nikon, they don't have to change anything, Grant, and they just go, oh, Nikon lens, oh, that's fine, just gets the tick and gets through. So with Grant's lens here, it has to make some corrections. To be actually, Grant, to be all fairness, it really didn't change it by much at all. So I'll be honest and fair. But especially when you're using, he used a 24 to 70, there's not a lot of distortion there, and there's usually, it's a good quality lens, there's not much vignetting. So there's really not much that it does to Grant's lens. When you use wide angle lenses, you're naturally going to have some bends there, and this will fix those bends in your image. Instead of having a bent horizon, it will fix those little areas in the photo. So I find that quite handy. I always tick it on. I actually have it ticked on my actual computer. It does it on import, so you can do on import, you can tell it to do different things to your photos. That's the only thing I do on import, is I tell it to lens correct everything. It also has this tool for removing any chromatic aberration. So I always have that ticked on as well. Same thing again, Grant, Nikon lenses, that just doesn't exist. So I'm getting some wicked looks here. So I always have those ticked on, even though I don't need them, Grant. Transform I don't use. Effects down, I'm nearly done and I'll swing over to you. Effects is if you're wanting to put a vignette on. I say be very careful when you're playing with that. I don't do it generally on landscape stuff, because as you move it on, it looks like you're looking through binoculars. Some nature stuff it might come handy in, but for landscape I don't really touch about it. Grain is actually a handy one for if you want a particular look, you can actually add grain into your photo, which some people say you're crazy and insane and all the rest of it. Everything has to be pin sharp. And they can't see you, Grant. I've got your camera off. But they think you're crazy and insane. And Grant was pointing at me, of course, if you're wondering what he was doing. But I find that if you want to give a particular look, I did some shots in cabins and wanted to give that grungy look to those photos to give you that feeling that you're out in the woods and you're out and roughing it. I actually add grain into the photo, and I think it helps a lot to portray a bit of a mood. And photography is grain, so I think some people get a bit carried away with that. I will now pass over to Grant. He's been patiently waiting, and if I'll shoot over to, that's right, it's over here, and we'll have a look at what Grant's doing. So we're going to cut that episode there. Obviously, myself and Grant waffle on too long, so this will be a 2-part episode. And with that, if you haven't already done so, hit subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up if you liked the video, and we'll see you in part 2 in the next episode. Bye bye.